Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out. I'm Derek Pratt, Director of Education and Public Programming here at the Erie Canal Museum. Thank you very much for joining us today. The impact of the Erie Canal has been immense, socially, economically, politically, and artistically. One area where the Erie Canal, in part, transformed the nation was in the Hudson River School, and we are pleased today to be screening this excellent documentary on Thomas Cole's life, Reframing an Empire, brought to you by WMHT, the Capital Region's PBS affiliate. Afterwards, we are going to have a panel moderated by our own Steph Adams and featuring Renée Berry, our former research fellow here from 2021 to 2023, who was featured, and Nicole Slyke from WMHT as well. We are grateful for both of them for being here. Without further ado then, we'll get started on playing this.
If both of you would just want to reintroduce yourselves to the folks here and at home before we get started.
Yeah, I'm Nicole Slyke. I was the producer editor on this piece in this film. Kubisch is in the back. He was one of the main videographers. He hates being pointed out, so I like to do it for him. And I think he did a great job too.
And I'm Renée Berry. I was the Erie Canal Research Fellow here at the museum and in the documentary, and thank you all for being here.
Okay, so the folks at home missed me saying I just have a few quick questions to ask Nicole and Renée in conversation, and then we will open it up to audience questions. So if there's anything you're jonesing to know, there will be a time for that. I thought maybe we would start with the title, Reframing an Empire. Quite provocative. If either of you had thoughts on that and on what that process actually means?
Yeah, so we actually started trying to think of a title. We were going through some iterations of it, and then one of our first interviews was with Renée, and she talked a lot about the empire, the name of the state, and that really stuck out to us. And we were thinking about not only are we looking at New York State as a whole and looking at its history, but there's also a couple of Thomas Cole titled pieces that have the word empire in it. So just kind of, painting, analogy, Renée's profound thoughts, everything kind of came together there.
Thanks for saying that. I really like the title because in the fellowship that I did here, we talked a lot about expanding narratives, and I think expanding usually involves bringing more voices in. And what's important about reframing is that when we bring the perspectives in that have been marginalized, the whole picture starts shifting. And so this idea of a more holistic shaping of a new picture, that's what I like about the title. And I think what's important about this process of reframing is that there were a lot of different voices involved. That's a different type of process than Thomas Cole's individual perspective on the canvas. There was a dialogue.
Yeah, I will admit the artistic reframing part of the title was lost on me until today, and I was like, oh yes, of course. Frames of paintings.
Yeah.
But so that broad conversation that you're talking about, Thomas Cole is a really interesting jumping off point to talk about all of these different histories that end up popping up in the documentary. Maybe some that some viewers were surprised to hear about when attending a screening about a documentary on a landscape painter. So I was wondering if you, Nicole, would maybe want to talk a little bit about how all of this came together. When you set forth to make this documentary on the whole, did you anticipate the product coming out like this?
No, so we were in touch with the Thomas Cole House at WHT, and they wanted to kind of look at Thomas Cole as a narrative of talking about landscape painting and how we now look at it differently than versus the time when he was painting. When we started doing research on the period of time, we were finding out that there was so much that happened in New York State particularly that we kind of skip over. And there's these like two bookends to his life, and then there's him in the middle of painting. So we, in our exploring Thomas Cole, we actually started exploring everything but Thomas Cole, which became really interesting that we had to keep injecting him back into the conversation because that was the original starting point. But it became that a lot of history neglects to talk about some of these important factors. So then we sought out all of these experts in this area of what have we not talked about when we look at these pictures or we look at these paintings or go into these museums. What are these narratives that were happening outside of the frame of these paintings and what made them be where they are? And that's how we ended up here at the Erie Canal Museum. And we ended up talking to at UAlbany, some of the professors studying Africana history. And we got into this whole large dialogue amongst all these things where we created a 10-part series, and each part of that series is a different chapter that was kind of left out of history books as maybe the last generation learned it. And now we've created an entire curriculum that you can access PBS Learning, and you can go to each one of those pieces, and then teachers can download the curriculum and teach through the curriculum using the videos as kind of a guide. So it started out as just kind of this small documentary, and it turned into reshaping an entire curriculum, which I think is a really nice evolution to help this live on even longer than just airing on television.
What has the reception been like to that curriculum?
It just got finished for the next school year. So our education professionals just wrapped it up, I believe, last month. It's gotten a lot of accolades from like the national PBS office because they are the ones that have to pass it through all the curriculum guidelines for the entire country, which is a very tedious process. It's not my job, luckily, but it will be available for, I believe it's 7th grade through like a 10th or 11th grade is they were aiming at. So upper middle school, lower high school grades, and teachers can incorporate it into their curriculum starting for the 2024-2025 school year.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Renee will be in every classroom.
Renée, in the film, you mentioned the big environmental impacts of the Erie Canal. I was wondering if you would want to elaborate more on some of those and how that relates to climate change today.
Sure. So yeah, I came here as a fellow interested in doing research, but I had my degree in environmental studies. And I was kind of surprised to see when I traveled around the state of New York how the Erie Canal was represented in this very celebratory way after having just gotten my master's and doing all this research about like the harms of industrialization and the impacts of transportation and settler colonialism in their central role in climate change. So when I started seeing all of these romantic representations of New York history, I became a little concerned. And so in that way, I feel like a little similar to Thomas Cole of like having this feeling of like, oh, we need to have these conversations. I'm concerned about environmental issues. So the way that the Erie Canal is usually talked about is we acknowledge that there were these huge changes, huge transformative changes that have brought, but there's this assumption that they were positive changes. And we know that there were a lot of different impacts to the Erie Canal, and some of them were at the expense of certain people. And so with that type of language, we're leaving out a lot of the impacts that contextualize climate change today. So I think getting into this idea of like what wilderness is, what these myths are of American history is so necessary for us to understand the present moment and how we can actually start working together through through actually listening to each other and building trust, because we're gonna need to really work together with this crisis that we all find ourselves in. And so that's something I'm concerned about, like Thomas.
Yeah, I think some people might hear like climate change and think like, oh, this is maybe something to be talked about in a science museum. We obviously are a history museum. I don't know if either of you had any thoughts on why it's important that we talk about this kind of issue in a history museum of all places.
Yeah, I think there's no way to really understand the climate crisis without history. And environmental issues, in my perspective at least, are interconnected with every single thing that we do. And so even in the way that museums take such good care of their collections and think about preserving certain items, if we don't have a livable planet to live on, what is the point of preserving these items? Like, what future are we going to be in that these items that we're taking care of them for? So I just think that museums are a really important place to contextualize what's going on and to reflect reality to us. And this is a shared issue that we're all facing together. And museums, I think, have an important role in like helping us have these hard conversations that we need to have.
Yeah, I think something that struck me in this is I didn't know a lot about Thomas Cole when I started this, so I became more engaged with his work, and to see how much of his work was talking about his fear of industrialization and, you know, ruining the scenery. And then knowing that that was happening in 1840 and he was scared about it, it makes me worried that we still are not, it's not a new issue. It's not something, I think we think it's kind of like a hot button topic that just started creeping up on us, but we've been talking about this since the, you know, birth of our country. And it just, I don't know, it made me more nervous. So I think it's important to look back and see that where the conversation started and maybe to keep engaging in it.
So one of the Cole fellows in the film, Sophia, at the end talks about how historical figures can simultaneously be important, but also fallible, and how it's important that we reckon with that history. I think that also just applies to the canal in general. It's important, but it's like what you were talking about, it's important, but it's fallible. But in terms of human figures, for us here at the museum, one of those is DeWitt Clinton himself. And Derek, if you could hear me, if you could advance the slide one, please. I could drastically call out to him the way that he did to me. Renee, you recently had an interview with Matt about reinterpreting this artifact in their American wing. And I was wondering if maybe this was, from what I understand, a base that was to be presented to DeWitt Clinton after the canal had been completed. I was wondering if you want to share with everyone a little bit about this.
Sure, yeah. So even the Met is going through their own like reframing process, and they're thinking about how to reinterpret their American wing of their collection. And they approached me and my co-author, or the co-author to my research paper on the Erie Canal. They read our paper on kind of reframing the Erie Canal and wanted us to speak to these two vases actually they're made out of silver, and they were commissioned by New York merchants and presented to DeWitt Clinton, who's often treated like a very central, like main character of the Erie Canal. And when they were giving this to him as a gift to basically say thank you for all the success that we're going to have in the future due to the Erie Canal. And on the vase of this thank you gift, it says, "To the Honorable DeWitt Clinton, whose claim to the proud title of public benefactor is founded on those magnificent works, referring to the canal. So we talked about how DeWitt Clinton gets a lot of credit for the Erie Canal, kind of like in the film talking about Thomas Cole getting all this exclusive credit for what happens in the house at the Thomas Cole house, but there's so many other people involved in the construction of the Erie Canal, and not everyone got these types of gifts. We also talked about this idea that the Erie Canal benefited everyone and that DeWitt Clinton was a public benefactor. This is also made more complicated when you go into the archives and do more research into the impacts of the Erie Canal, because it makes me ask who is included in the public in this understanding of how the Erie Canal benefited the public. Because we know that DeWitt Clinton and his father had very genocidal views about the indigenous peoples of New York, and that the construction of the canal was contingent upon their dispossession. So when I see an artifact like this, it kind of reminds me of Thomas Cole's paintings too, where it looks really beautiful at first, and there's something more, which is the context of a violent history, that you really need to spend more time with these pieces. So I was glad the Met wanted to start having these conversations. And yeah, I hope that more museums start to do this kind of process.
Yeah, for sure. The image is not great, but the detail on the left, you can see on the base that's actually the aqueduct over the Genesee in Rochester. And you're right, DeWitt Clinton certainly did not do the labor necessary to build the aqueduct. Okay, so I have one final question for you both before we hand it over to the audience, but particularly at the beginning of the documentary, there's a lot of talk about how Cole is part of building this new national aesthetic. Like, we didn't really know who we were, and we needed something to hold on to visually. I was wondering how, if at all, do you think that we see the impact of that particular nature-focused national aesthetic on our culture today?
Yeah, I mean, I think that just museums in general are just going to see those beautifully framed halls of all those paintings of landscapes. Like, we still idealize it. It's just harder to get to, and it's becoming, more and more important to preserve it. So it's still something that we hold on to as this idealized version of what is our identity. But I also think that even in his paintings, there were these like little hints, like smokestacks or railroads or the Erie Canal coming in, or steamboats. Thomas Cole had a real gripe against the steamboat. So there's these hints that we can still look to inside these paintings to kind of get a deeper story and look into them. But yeah, did that answer the question?
I was thinking about that question when you shared it earlier with me, and I think this idea of wilderness as a myth is one that is also a conversation that isn't as far along as it should be. I think unlearning this idea of wilderness is going to be really important for us all to start grappling with the themes of empire in American history. And I think it's very common that people look at Thomas Cole's paintings of wilderness and think of them as a very beautiful, romantic, sublime, picturesque scene, when there's more context given. We're looking at artifacts of violence, of a much bigger picture. So I think there's a lot that his romantic his romantic representations of the land has still continued to have on the like mainstream environmental movement, where environmental issues are kind of based on conservation and protecting beautiful scenes, and it has to go deeper than that. It has to go to like some of the more critical conversations that were happening in the film about like who makes decisions about land, whose land is being represented, who represents, you know, who gets to define what environmental issues are and environmental solutions. There's so much inequality in environmental conversations. And so I think unlearning this idea that Thomas Cole left us with, wilderness, is gonna be like, start to undo and kind of spiral us out of where we've been with the invisibilization of harm in American history.
I think when I think about this question, the work of Cole and other Hudson River landscape artists taught Americans how to look at and relate to nature, and it was this wilderness, this thing that was separate from us, an object apart from us, but thinking about, and like what you said earlier, Nicole, about being worried, since this has like been to some extent or other something that people have been, in terms of environmental impact, that people have been talking about since the formation of the country. But these contemporary artists that are talked about at the end of the documentary, that are then showing us how to reconfigure that relationship with land, that we are a part of nature and that it's not separate from us. There's obviously a lot that needs to be done. And I also have this existential dread most of the time, but I do think that like one step that's a part of this, and part of how like art can help us with this, is starting to en masse think about ourselves as a part of it all and not just separate. But I think, does anyone have any questions? Or on Zoom, but I don't have the iPad and I'm hoping that someone will, oh.
Yeah, I have. We don't have any just yet, but.
Could I say something to what,
Yeah,
so
we can just keep talking.
Yeah. I think that was what I was trying to get at in the beginning of the documentary, with this idea that nature is this aesthetic thing, like, that's what kind of really bugs me about Thomas Cole, is this objectification of nature as if it's like this beautiful object, and how, I think that's just missing the point. It's our home. It's where we all live. We're related to it. We're inseparable from it. And so when harm is being done to the planet and to the environment, it's harming us, and there's really no way around that. So yeah, I think I like what you said about just like unlearning that separation, thinking of humans as somehow separate from nature, and thinking of humans as not even animals, when we are animals and we're part of the environments that we are dependent upon. I think that's going to be helpful for us to address the climate crisis that you brought up earlier and is always on my mind.
Yeah, I was wondering, during the course of making it, it's one of the few things about the Hudson River School I've ever seen, kind of, that does not try to tack on to a course of empire. It's a series of paintings. Were you ever kind of tempted to do that at any point? But, what were some of the people you spoke to's takes on course of empire and stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I like briefly scanned over them, because they're obviously a very big part of the collection of work, but again, we were trying to reframe it. Be like, let's talk about everything else that we don't usually talk about when we walk into the space of the gallery. So what is outside of just kind of objectifying this work or having it come down? And honestly, a lot of the experts that we talked to were more familiar with the localized work, like the Catskill scenery. I don't know if that's just because we were in New York talking to people, but we were also talking to historians who were more interested in, you know, the context and the content. And I think Course of Empire is a little bit more holistic and like a spiritual sense that may be above this conversation in a different way, but not separated, just more familiar to it.
Oh, then you reframed it. The whole thing.
It was there for a second, we skimmed over. And it's in the title, it's like a wink at it. Great question.
Anything pop up on?
Doesn't look like it. Didn't have his dad having trouble doing things.
Curious, like, your experience in making films, is this a normal process where you start out with some idea and like, oh, this is what we're gonna film, and then through the course of filming, you realize you're gonna have to change it, or is this a unique like experience or concept?
At the production house of WHT PBS, we usually have a set goal in mind and a story in mind, and that's kind of how we engage with the community, because we've either identified a storyline or a grant or something that kind of helps us. I think in documentary, it's better to not know the story because it reveals itself more truthfully to you if you don't go in with a scripted narrative to start. For this, we were lucky enough to kind of not know a lot about Thomas Cole, and that ignorance kind of provided the outline for us. So, you know, we weren't coming with an expertise or an understanding of the history of the Erie Canal to Renee. We were kind of like, hi, saw you on the website. Could you tell us about this, you know, steamboat situation that seems to be pissing Thomas Cole off? So, you know, we learned through that. And I think because we didn't know a lot, we got to learn a lot, and that was beneficial. So currently in this, we do tend to know the story because we have to, because of the constraints of time and other things. But I think in the greater world of the art of documentary, it's looked more friendly upon to not know what the story is going to be and to follow the story. Good question.
Are you anticipating any pushback with the new curriculum? People in education who might take issue with it?
Like Florida.
Yeah.
That or-
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few states out there that could benefit more from this curriculum, which is our hope, to give access to it to the public, which, you know, it's free, it's online, it's available for anyone who's doing homeschooling or for in the classroom. And that's the most that we have the power to do. So that's our hope, that people tap into it and use it. There's pushback on everything that we do in some way or another. We haven't heard anything yet. Again, it's new. I hope not. I'm sure it will be out there, but in general, this has been received pretty well so far. I think my only critique of it is there's too much information in it. It's just, we really set the parameters from Thomas Cole's life, like 1801 to 1848. And we had to even push that to like 1860, because we're like, okay, 1860, but it was very hard to include all, I mean, any documentary that has like Elizabeth Cady Stanton on the screen for 30 seconds and be like just noting that she was here also. And Susan B. Anthony like flashes by and is like, we have too much going on, but that was all happening in this short period of time. So I'm sure within all of those things between gender studies and environmental studies and race studies, somebody's gonna have a problem with the way that we presented something, but as Elizabeth says at the end, like, you should always have kind of a conversation and provide context. This isn't the finite answer. We don't expect that at all.
Okay, well, I think, again, to both of you, thank you very much for coming out and congrats again on the documentary. And thank you to everyone here and at home for joining us. Any housekeeping things?
If you haven't got enough, Hudson River School, March 7th, we got another deeper dive with Dr. Sancho Scott on Indigenous perspectives.
Okay.
But, thank you.